Planning a fishing trip shouldn't feel like a full-time job. With fishingbooker.com, you can find and book the perfect fishing trip within minutes. Fishingbooker.com connects you with trusted fishing captains around the world. Booking is fast, easy, and secure, with access to verified customer reviews, loyalty rewards, and around-the-clock customer support. Everything you need to book with confidence is in one place. So head to fishingbooker.com and start planning your next fishing adventure today.
Membership means more with American Express Business Gold. Earn 4 times membership rewards points in your top 2 eligible spending categories every month, including eligible U.S. advertising purchases and select media, and U.S. purchases at restaurants, including takeout and delivery. What are you waiting for? Get the card that flexes with your spending every month. Terms and points cap apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold Card. Built for business by American Express.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. 3 administrative notes to make as we begin episode 389. The first is, and you may have noticed already, my voice is not exactly in a great place. The trees are trying to kill me, as often happens in the spring, but I'm still going to give it the old college try. It just might be a shorter episode than usual. Secondly, this is episode 389, which means next episode is 390, which means it's another basically listener Q&A podcast. We call it Accusations. Why? Because I solicit your questions, your comments, your accusations. Anything that you have read on the website, heard on the podcast, seen on the YouTube channel that you want elaboration on, if you have questions about it, if you have an opinion or a difference of opinion, let me know. Matthew at castingacross.com. It's always fun to get that feedback. I generally get a lot more feedback in the weeks after those podcasts, and so this is my reminder to send those emails now. Even if I don't address it on air, I do my best to get back to you in a timely manner personally. And thirdly, this is a Cast1 episode, which means it is kind of more aimed at the fundamentals, but I think this episode in particular is one that will hopefully be pertinent for folks who've been fishing for a long time. I anticipate there'll be at least one piece of information in these 4 main points that will be helpful to you, and bare minimum, it will give you the information to pass on to folks that you are helping learn to fish, if you've got something like that in your life. So without further ado, we'll talk about technology in fly fishing. Now, I'm not talking about social media. I'm not talking about, AI, nothing like that. I'm not even talking about using technology to design fly rods or fly lines. I mean, that's all good and fine, and it has its role and is worth talking about. But today I'm talking about ways that you can use your computer or your phone, either as you're planning to get out on the water or you are already on the water, that will help you make better fishing choices. I'm not talking about some sort of fish finding app or even some sort of camera. We're talking about data that you can use that is just basically the 21st century version of what you would have gotten in like a newspaper or in a map only a matter of generations ago. And so we'll start with the most basic one, and that is weather. Okay, so everyone has a weather app baked into their phone. Everyone, when you turn on the news, the weather is right there. Are you syncing up the information on that you're getting with the weather with what you're seeing when you're on the water? So there's 2 ways to look at this, and I'm going to actually speak to the folks who have been fishing for a long time first, and myself included. When we see the weather, it's 65 outside or 45 outside, or it's going to be 75 outside, that tells us a couple of things. What are we going to wear? How many layers do we need to have? What kind of socks do we need to, put into our waders? That's important. And then we see the wind. Okay, now that might help us figure out, first of all, where we're going to go fish. If it's going to be really windy, we need to go someplace where there's going to be some tree cover, and it's going to be a little more closed in. If it's going to be totally clear and not going to be windy at all, then we can go kind of fish wherever. But it could be that if it is windier, we might bring that heavier rod. So instead of the 4-weight, we bring the 6-weight or something like that. That's all good information to have. But what I think is really, really helpful is with that kind of information, and then other pieces of data. What was the overnight low? What is the barometer? What is when was sunrise? When is sunset? All of that information that is just thrown at us in so many different ways. Are we doing a good job? Am I doing a good job syncing that up with my experience? So let me explain kind of what I'm getting at here. And if you're a new angler and this is what you can do from day one, and if you've been fishing for a long time, this is something that maybe you can pay attention to a little bit better, because I know that I can always do a better job on this. What I should do as I'm fishing is just take mental notes. What are the bugs doing? What are the fish doing? How do my feet feel, for example, to make it very, very mundane? And then look at the weather. Look at what it was overnight. Look at what it was while I'm fishing. And what you start to do is assimilate a bunch of data points and variables so that you can make informed decisions about what happens the next time you're on the water. This is a great thing if you already are very familiar with a particular river and you're just kind of intuitively knowing what to do when you go out there. The water feels like this. The air feels like this. I'm going to be a little more aggressive in the way I fish flies. Or it feels a little bit chilly. Things feel a little bit dead. I'm gonna really downsize my flies, fish really slow, make sure those nymphs are dinking off the bottom. That kind of stuff you will intuit over time, but to add in all those data points of what's happening from a weather perspective, water temperature, which you're probably not going to necessarily get. We'll talk about ways you can get some stream data here in a minute, but even if you bring a little stream side thermometer, it's a couple of bucks, throw it in your vest. That's another great data point. Take that with the air temperature, overnight low, daily high, and some other variables, and you can start to really get a bead on what the rhythm of that particular river is. So that's the first one. It's so basic, it's so essential, but I think it's one of those things where maybe 2 generations ago, people talked about this and paid attention to this a little bit more because they had to do it in a much more manual fashion than we do now, where so much of that data gets fed to us automatically. However, as is often the case, the quantity of data and the use of that data, our functional use of that, aren't necessarily tracking together. I think our functional use has dropped even though the quantity has gone up. So if you're a new angler, all that is to say, pay attention to the weather. You have it in front of you, whether it's on your phone, you're turning on the TV, or you're on your computer that morning, and then just take that information and keep that as a data point as you then go on the river and notice what's happening. And once you get a big enough sample size, then I think you really start to see some trends. That's definitely something that is worth paying attention to. All right, so that's the first one. Second one has to do with maps. We have 2 points I'm going to make today that both have to do with maps. And the first one is utilize historical map data when it comes to looking at rivers. Historical map data when it comes to looking at rivers. And I think this is really important when it comes to exploration of really large streams and really small streams. Now, you might run into a hurdle with really small streams, and this is what I mean with really small streams. If you find a river that you're like, you drive over it, and you're like, that looks like a really cool stream to fish, it's worth going and fishing it. I'm not going to discourage you from doing that, but if it's in an area where it could potentially dry up in the summertime, there's a couple of rivers by me that they especially in their upper reaches, they basically get bone dry in the summertime. Even though that is not an automatic killing of the opportunity to fish, it's a good data point to have. So you go onto Google Maps or Google Earth and you can look at maps over time. There's a historical image widget that you can click and you can scroll back, as you get closer to today, there's monthly or maybe biannual photographs. Then as you go back through the decades, they become more spread out. But be able to see, is this something that does indeed dry up, or does it flow pretty consistently? If you go and fish a handful of times and you come up skunked in the spring, and you realize, in the summertime this thing dries out, and that's why there's not a lot of life here, that's a good thing to know instead of just beating your head against the wall. When it comes to larger rivers, I think this is really helpful because in the springtime, if the flows are high, then you're not going to necessarily be able to find that underwater structure as easily as you would if you were getting out there in the middle of the summer. A great example, I was just this morning up fishing in the middle part of New Hampshire, and there's a pretty large river that's running pretty high right now, and there are some places where I know there are fantastic holding spots for early season trout as well as bass as we move into the the late spring, early summer. But right now, all of those points are totally submerged. If you were a new angler, you could go ask somebody, which I'm, again, not going to discourage you from doing that. But if you were to look at historical imagery of, say, August of last year, you would see that there's a boulder field out in the middle of this river. Now, it may be that the wading is too dangerous right now, but if you were in a boat, you could get out into those spots and you could fish those boulders, you could fish those rocks, even though there's just a very small amount of chop on that water, or in some places it was completely smooth because the water is so high. That structure is still down there and is still holding fish. So you could, drive up and down that stream and go to find something on your own. You could get out in the middle of the river in your boat and keep an eye on what's going on underneath. You could go to a fly shop or, a local sporting goods store and say, hey, tell me where the rocks are. Or you could just click on the historical imagery on the maps and find where that water does have some structure, and it moves a little bit better when the water is lower. I think this is also a great way to find braided braided rivers. If you are wanting to get into a situation where the wading might be easier, where the water is more accessible, you can drive up and down that stream, but in places where those river, moves away from the road, being able to see that overhead picture can really help you find those spots that might be a little bit more accessible. It could be really long shoals, it could be really long gravel bars, or it could be those braids. But if you're a wading angler in particular, instead of just kind of going out there and beating the water until you turn up a fish, if you want to find some higher productivity spots, then using that aerial view in conjunction with the historical imagery can really help you find some spots that can be more accessible and more productive, and maybe even just give you a little bit more confidence as you're getting out there. All right, so number 1 is pay attention to the weather and all those data points. Number 2 is utilize overhead aerial historical data. Number 3 is make sure you understand stream flows. So waterdata.usgs.gov is something that you ought to bookmark. There are a remarkable number of monitoring stations across our country that the USGS keeps track of. And so the U.S. Geological Survey has some tools that they have on their website that you can bookmark, and I have a handful of bookmarks for a handful of streams, so just pay attention. It gives you right now what the flows are, which is a good data point, but kind of like the weather one, it's helpful to know what a certain cubic feet per second means. Under a certain point is probably too dry to fish, especially if you're fishing for trout in the summertime. It's going to stress them out, stay away. Then there's going to be a threshold of like, this is good wading and good fishing. And then another threshold level where it's like, this is where you can fish, but you got to wade carefully. And then there's another one that's like, just stay away because that flood stage, it's kind of dangerous. So it's good to have that data point. It's even better if you can functionally use it. But then also, a lot of those USGS monitoring stations will give you a historical picture for the last few days, the last few weeks, and you can even back it up even further than that in some situations, which is great because just because the water is flowing at a good level doesn't mean the clarity is going to be good. So if it has risen or fallen quickly, and then it still may be significantly off color, and you want to know that before you potentially make a choice to go there or not. And being able to access those stream flow levels will help you know if you're going to fish a watershed. Different streams behave differently, and so you can check on a couple and to see which ones have dropped a little bit faster, which ones have probably cleared out quicker than others. Especially if you're fishing tailwaters, this is vital. I mean, some can be unfishable in the morning and be great in the afternoon, or vice versa. And so being able to know how to use the USGS monitoring websites is very, very important. Sometimes fly shops will actually have those tools embedded into their stream reports, and so it's right there. But you want to be able to use that yourself and be able to access that information and then know how to read it and implement it. It is really, really helpful. especially if you don't want to be adventurous. You want to just go to where you want to go. So checking that data before you hop in the car can save you a lot of headaches. All right, weather's number 1. Aerial maps for finding spots to fish is number 2. And then USGS data is number 3. Number 4 is also a mapping tool that can be helpful. And this one is not going to be a picture. It's going to be the most basic map. So for Google Map, it's where, tan is land and blue is water. I think the blue is water. And this is where you are going to see streams that you might not otherwise see. You're going to see streams that you might not otherwise see. What do I mean by that? The mapping tools sometimes insert small feeder creeks that you may never notice as you are driving around or maybe even fishing. And I'll talk about why you might want this here in a second. But one of the things that is really important to know is that there are ways that data is entered into these maps that it differs. So it's going to be different in one place versus another. It's not consistent, but there are benefits to looking at these, not the satellite imagery, but the actual map imagery, not unlike if you have one of those old DeLorme atlases, which is really going to be your best bet. If you want to do this the best way possible, you get one of those, and you're going to see where there have been recorded examples of small feeder creeks entering into streams. Now, this could be a number of things. One, it could be a creek that you just didn't know was there. In one of the cities close to me, there's a couple of creeks that are perfectly fine little fisheries, but for about 40 yards, 50 yards before they enter the main river, they are culverts, or they go under the road. You would never know they were there. If you're even on the big river, you might even think that these are just like storm drains, but they're actual creeks that, because of the way the development happened, they got put underground. So you would never come across them on your own, but when you look at the maps, they appear as a little thin blue line running straight into the main river. And that's what got me onto these 2 creeks. It wasn't me driving around. It wasn't me fishing the big river. It was seeing these little blue lines and then going and realizing that these are year-round fisheries that you wouldn't have found unless you saw these little blue lines or were randomly exploring somewhere on this, in the woods adjacent to this river. So those exist. And even if they aren't legitimate fisheries in their own right, they do represent potentially a spring influence or a small feeder creek. And as you may be aware, anytime you have that water entering those rivers, it is going to add a little bit of warmer water in the wintertime and a little bit cooler water in the summertime. And that's the kind of thing that all manner of fish, warm water fish, cold water fish, are going to gravitate towards, because it's going to give them what they need when it is a little bit harder to find. So if you have a big river that you fish, then you can just scroll up and down on that river on that mapping tool and try to find places where those small rivers enter in. It doesn't have to be Google Maps either. You can use other mapping tools, and a lot of state conservation organizations or state game and fish departments will have maps like this where they have entered in data and survey data and sampling data. And, again, there's a couple of creeks around here where, you see this little line that represents, we did some sampling here. I think there's no creek there. And you go, and there's no bridge, and there's nothing. And then you realize, okay, there's actually a small creek that goes underground and then, pops up somewhere in this river. But it actually appears as you go up in the woods. And it's a small brook trout fishery, but it's something. And unless you're just walking the woods randomly, you're not going to run across it. Because generally the way we find feeder creeks is that we're fishing a larger river and we see a creek enter from river right or river left and we follow it. This is a little bit different, but it's just as productive oftentimes. So those are 4 ways that you can use technology to hopefully discover more fishing or improve your fishing. The first, all that data, particularly weather, pay attention to it, figure out what it means. Number 2, use that aerial and historical data to find places to fish more effectively and efficiently. Number 3, get comfortable using that USGS stream flow information so that you can have a better grasp on what's happening, where you want to fish, or if where you're fishing isn't working, someplace else as a second option. And number 4, use mapping tools and use maps that don't rely on satellite imagery to find small streams to fish, or the small streams that are going to do something to the large rivers that you are fishing. Any questions about this? If you have a fifth thing that you think is essential, then let me know. I'm going to share a tool here at the end, an app that combines some of these resources in my weekly recommendation. This week on castingacross.com, the first article that came out was called Bait and Switch, in which I share 3 stories, I think 3, about times where I wasn't fishing with bait, but for all intents and purposes, a live animal was being used to catch fish with a fly rod. You just have to go read Bait and Switch, and you'll know what I mean. Wednesday's article was actually a video, but not a book review video. It was called 3 Fly Fishing Gadgets to Take Everywhere. So I have a lot of stuff. I mean, before I started casting across, I had a lot of stuff. But since I started casting across, whether through demos or through product reviews, whatever it is, I just have all sorts of things. And I have a lot of fly rods, a lot of reels. But what I have a lot of is small gear and gadgets, which is awesome because I have 5 boys, so they're never going to have to buy a pair of forceps in their life. But that means I've used a lot of different types of forceps. And what may surprise you is that the most expensive ones aren't the ones that I carry. The most feature-rich ones aren't the ones that I carry. The same is true as nippers. The same is true of gear storage. And so in this video, I talk about the 3 things that I have really settled into a groove the last few seasons to use more often than not when I'm fishing for freshwater fish. So check that video out over on YouTube. Of course, you can get to it on Casting Across as well. This week's recommendation on the podcast is an app I've talked about before. It's called Trout Routes. So Trout Routes is a great way to figure out a lot of what I've talked about in one handy place. So notice what I've done here in the podcast. I've talked about ways you can get all this information for free. And now I'm saying if you want the shortcut, you can pay for it with Trout Routes. It is not ridiculously expensive. I think the whole year is like $30-ish bucks. If I'm not, no, $58.99 for Pro, which I think is the same price that I pay for like Onyx. But they oftentimes do run sales. But you can get a basic access for free. And it gives you just views of trout streams. You can click around in it. But this is not a place where you can share your catches and stuff like that. This is truly just a tool. What I like about it is it gives you access points. It gives you precise locations that you can get offline of where special regulations change. For me, where I'm fishing like between New Hampshire and Massachusetts a lot, it's really helpful to have that between Vermont and, for Vermont and New Hampshire is pretty easy because there's a really big river in between the 2 states. But I know where I'm at. I know how I can fish, how I can't fish. And then you get that stream flow data is up to date right there also. So again, all that information is accessible in different formats, but to have it all in one place is handy. And talk to the guys that do Trout Routes a couple of months ago at the fly fishing shows. And then they've got some really cool app-specific resources that they are going to be rolling out in the very near future. So I'll put a link to Trout Routes in this podcast's show notes over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app, rate the podcast in Spotify and in Apple Podcasts. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.